Okay, brilliant. So welcome everybody. We have 150 people tuning in right now. We will have up to 200 tuning in total. I'll give you a little introduction as to how the event is going to work. Firstly, if you haven't seen the film, Inside Out, then you still have access to it until July. So the link still works. And don't worry, the panel discussion is not reliant upon watching the documentary. So don't feel, oh, I didn't have time to watch the documentary, this isn't going to mean anything to me. Absolutely not. This is a standalone panel discussion, although most of the people on the panel this evening are featured in the documentary. And in fact, we will be hearing from them. They'll be doing their own intros to let you know who they are. But before that, the setup for tonight will work like this. Basically, the first half will be a series of questions that have been specially selected for each of our panel members to help showcase their particular area of expertise. So there'll be a specific question to Anthony Peake, for example. Then when he's answered, we'll open it up to the rest of the panelists, and then to Susan Blackmore, and then we'll open up the rest of the panelists. In the second half, so about 8:30 or so, we'll have a short 10-minute break. Then in the second half of the night, we'll open up the question to the floor, which means the 200 plus audience members will have a chance to ask their specific questions to the panel. So the way that works is there's a Q&A box down there, and you'll click the Q&A box and put your question there. I've seen a few questions already in there. And the cool thing about the Q&A box is you can vote up people's questions with a little kind of thumb up sign, a little kind of Facebook like. And obviously, if there's a question there that resonates with the one that you wanted to ask, or is a similar question, then probably rather than writing such a similar question, just vote up that one. And then Amir from Psychedelic Society, he will be kind of curating that Q&A box, and he will be choosing which questions to ask based on how many votes they get and also the relevance of those questions. The questions can be put to a specific panel member, or they can be put to the panel in general. Anything else to talk about the technical side of things, Amir, before we carry on?
Just to say to all the attendees, if it's your first time joining a Zoom webinar, because there's often lots of questions around mics and all that kind of stuff, if you don't see yourself on the screen, it means you're an attendee and you're not meant to be able to see your video on the screen. It's the panelists that you can see on the screen, so you don't have to worry about muting yourself. We won't be able to hear you. You don't have to worry about your video. You can participate, as Charlie explained, using the Q&A box. And there's also the chat box. If you've got a question that's for the panel, make sure to use the Q&A box, because there tends to be so many comments in the chat box that questions get lost there. And if you want your chat to be visible to all the other attendees, make sure to select to all panelists and other attendees. And I think you can message me privately. So I'm here just to basically help with the technical side of tonight. So if you're having some kind of technical issue or technical question about the webinar, you can message me.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to kick off by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves in under a minute, if possible. So I'm going to start on my left, as the screen shows itself, with Anthony Peake. Please introduce yourself tonight.
Hello, everybody. My name is Anthony Peake. I'm an author. I've written now 11 books, all of which are my search for understanding exactly what the human experience is, and particularly interested in extraordinary human experiences. So I've written books about the out-of-body experience, near-death experiences, our perceptions of time. I've also written a biography of Philip K. Dick, the American science fiction writer. I've co-authored a book with Irving Laszlo on the universe, the consciousness, and whether consciousness survives death. I've also written work on J.B. Priestley, particularly on J.B. Priestley's time plays. And I'm moving more and more now into areas of interest in terms of entheogens, dimethyltryptamine, and what consciousness is in terms of its relationship with the universe. My particular areas, my starting point is always science, and I take science as the starting point, and from there I move into describing and understanding what people experience and their interpretations of these things. So from my point of view, I'm probably a skeptic that has moved towards more of an area of acceptance that these extraordinary experiences need extraordinary explanations. So that's basically me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anthony. Next, we'll have Dr. Susan Blackmore.
Hello. Yep, I'm Sue Blackmore. I'm a visiting professor in psychology at Plymouth University. And I guess I'm here because in 1970, as an 18-year-old student, I had a very dramatic, completely out of the blue, to me, incomprehensible experience in which I seemed to leave my body, could see around everything, then went off with a silver cord floating across the, you know, around the world, tried to come back. It's a long story, but then went away again, then tried to get back inside, got too small, then tried to get bigger, got too big, and had a classic mystical experience of oneness, simply self-disappearing into everything else. Along the way, all kinds of interesting things happened, meeting with beings and other stuff like that. At the time, I called it astral projection because that's all I knew about. I joined the Psychic Research Society at Oxford, and you know, I'd read a couple of books on astral projection. So I just assumed that my astral body or my soul had left my body. I then completely illogically, but forgivably, jumped to the conclusion that the following things must be true: telepathy, clairvoyance, out of life beyond the body, consciousness beyond death, psychokinesis, ghosts, poltergeist. And I was determined to become a parapsychologist. So I did my PhD on parapsychology. I spent the first 10, 15 years of my research life looking for these phenomena and never finding them. And it's really taken me all of my life since then to finally, I would say, now come to terms with what that experience means. And that's because we have the neuroscience to understand it. And for me, the joy of investigating out-of-body experiences, just apart from having them, and encouraging other people to enjoy them and make the most of them, is that we can understand them in neuroscientific terms. We do not need to invent astral bodies, souls, spirits, and other worlds. You can invent them. Maybe they are there, but we don't need to because we've got enough explanations. So that's where I'm coming from. And I do genuinely think that OBEs can be life-changing. Well, changed my life. My whole life's been kind of driven to understand consciousness because of that experience. But in the end, I find the science much more exciting and interesting than speculations that don't take us to any further questions or any further understanding.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sue Blackmore. Next up, Dr. David Luke.
Oh, hi, everybody. So, yeah, I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Greenwich. I'm also an honorary researcher at Imperial College at the Psychedelic Research Centre there. And I also teach on the MSc in consciousness, spirituality and transpersonal psychology at Liverpool John Moores and Aleph Trust. So I guess I'm a psychologist by training. I wasn't always. I was a screwed up teenager and I wanted to know why. And so I studied psychology, and so I'm still screwed up, but at least I know why now. And I guess my primary interests are what my core experiences or transpersonal experiences, which covers out-of-body experiences, near-death, mystical experience, all of that groovy stuff. But I primarily research kind of altered states as they relate to these kind of exceptional experiences. But specifically, I do a lot of research on psychedelics. I don't always do research on psychedelics. Sometimes I'm not on psychedelics, but it's not as much fun. So, and so I have an interest in out-of-body experiences and where that intersects with neurobiology and psychedelic experience.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Next up, Graham Nicholls.
Hi, I'm Graham Nicholls. I'm an author. I'm a research subject, an advisory board member, and educator at the Ryan Research Centre. I'm focused on out-of-body experiences. I also don't subscribe to anything to do with souls, astral bodies, or astral planes, or any of that kind of stuff. And I think that we can explore all of that through the science, but I think the best science is also within the area of parapsychology. So that's why I'm working in that area and taking part in experiments into telepathy, recognition, micro PK, etc. So I've worked with Rupert Sheldrake, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and the Ryan doing experiments into those areas. So that's really where I'm coming from. I also have a history with installation art. So I've worked with virtual reality and different technologies to try and enhance these kinds of experiences and develop technology that help to access these kinds of states. So also very interested in things like sensory deprivation and different methodologies to induce altered states of consciousness that don't use psychedelics and things like that. So take a slightly different angle. But yeah, I think the science is the way forward. We need to start moving into a different paradigm, but I guess I include all of the science, not just the stuff that says there isn't anything to it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Graham. Next up, Luciana Haill.
There we go. Hello, everybody. I'm Luciana Haill. I'm an artist and a researcher. And for 25 years, I've been using a combination of brainwave technologies to investigate what I now know are altered states, which come from a long interest as a child in reading about these unusual phenomena. And in the last few years, I've been a research fellow for Sussex University in the Department of Consciousness. And I've explored lucid dreaming specifically. I had meningitis personally, which is horrendous, recovered fully, but that's when I had a first kind of out-of-body experience. Since then, I went on to help kind of develop the software for a brainwave visualization system that I've since become known for selling. And I help people as an artist to explore accessing an altered state through maybe endogenous methods, so through strobe lights and a combination of sonic feedback and neurofeedback using the brain and lighting combined. For whatever reason, they're not prepared to maybe, you know, take the medicines or haven't spontaneously had their own experience. So I study them scientifically, interview people, and build it all together into installations, involving different technologies. And I'm very pleased to take part tonight. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Luciana Haill. Next up, Jade Shaw.
Hello, everybody. If you've seen the film, you probably know who I am already, so I'll keep it short. So I'm an out-body experience researcher and teacher. So I was a choreographer for many years. My area of choreography was a site-specific choreographer. So I looked at how can we change people's perceptions of unusual spaces, such as abandoned places, warehouses, libraries, through the way in which our bodies moved within it in space. And then I had an out-body experience, changed my life. I was like, what the heck is this? This is crazy. And decided to leave my company, and then embarked on a master's degree in transpersonal psychology. And for my research, I looked at how people are affected by having an out-of-body experience. So my work really is about the field work, about the experiential side. Yes, teaching people how to have the experiences for self-transformation.
Cool. Thanks, Jade. And finally, Dr. Oliver Robinson.
Hi, Charlie. Hi, everybody. So, yeah, my name's Ollie. I like Dave, work at the University of Greenwich. And I'm a psychologist by trade. And I've also written a book on science and spirituality called Paths Between Head and Heart, which puts forward the premise that science and spirituality are complementary but overlapping domains of knowing. And yeah, my psychological specialism is adult development, life transitions, crises, spiritual change, existential shifts, the way that identity morphs and transforms over the course of adulthood particularly. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Jane.
Brilliant, thank you. My name's Charlie Morley. I write books about lucid dreaming and Tibetan dream yoga, and I'm your host for this evening. The first question that we're going to ask, we're going to open this kind of lightheartedly. I've got a timer on my phone, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists within 1 minute or less to define our central term for the evening, which is out-of-body experience. So this is a chance for us to see whether we're all singing from the same hymn sheet or have very differing views of what this term out-of-body experience means. So I'll go in the same order as I did the intros. There will be a 1 minute timer here, so please, if you hear the beat, then you need to stop if you can, unless you're like right in the middle of telling us what the meaning of life is through your definition, in which case, like, ignore the beat, right? So Anthony Peake, in 1 minute or less, what do you mean by the term out-of-body experience?
Well, it's like explaining life and everything else in 1 minute. But for me, the out-of-body experience is when somebody has the sensation that their perceptions are no longer in the body and are outside in a location in three-dimensional space. So effectively for me, the mystery then is how they are able to process that information they're perceiving. If there is no light waves hitting their eyes and their retina, how can they see things? How can they hear things? And is there any evidence that we can effectively ever be outside of our body in three-dimensional space? And this to me comes down to the root of what it is, whether the consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of brain chemistry and effectively chemicals reacting with electricity in the brain, or whether it tells us something that there is a difference between what
10
we
seconds.
Consciousness and reality. God, that was a quick minute.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Anthony. Okay, it's fun doing it in under a minute. Sue Blackmore, same question to you. Your 1 minute starts now.
Well, to answer your question, I think we're on the same hymn sheet so far. My formal definition is it's an experience in which you seem to perceive the world from a location outside your physical body. I've used that in all my books on this topic, and other scientists use it as well. It's a really good scientific definition because it says it's an experience. So if someone has any kind of experience in which they seem to be looking at the world from somewhere not, other than behind the eyes, that's an OBE. By definition, it counts. Why I stress this is because it leaves open the difficult questions of what's going on. It's defined as an experience, so we are then free to ask, does something leave the body, doesn't it, what's happening in the brain, any other number of questions. And I stress that because people say, I'm not sure if it was a real out-of-body experience. Yeah, it was an experience. Now let's ask the difficult questions. So that's where I'm coming from.
Brilliant. With 5 seconds to spare, thank you so much. David Luke, same to you, please, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, what Sue said, basically. Just a bit of shorthand. No, I agree with everything that's been said already. I will add to it that on some occasions people have a sense of autoscopy where they feel like they can see their own body as well from a disembodied perspective, often in the ceiling. And there may be other concomitant features with it, but not always. Although I would probably extend the limitations of dimensionality that Anthony referred to in terms of it being in a perceived three-dimensional space, because occasionally people perceive that they're in a beyond a three-dimensional space, even though they feel like they are disembodied. So I'd say that still counts as an out-of-body experience, and I've probably run out of time. So I'll leave it there.
You had 14 seconds to go, mate, but that was a pretty good explanation, I thought. Thank you, David. Graham Nicholls.
Well, I think we need more detail. I think actually these more general terms don't help that much, because the problem with that is a lot of the time, for example, in Olaf Blank's research and people like that, the focus is simply on being out of body, perceiving back at the physical body. But many OBEs don't follow that formula. Many OBEs don't even have a sense of a secondary body. Sometimes there's a completely different environment, all kinds of things like that. And then we have differences between experiences that happen in sleep paralysis, that happen from a waking state, that happen from various different cardiac arrest situations. So I think that there's a whole range of different elements that we need to kind of break down and look at in more detail. I think that an out-of-body experience is a description of what happens in terms of how it feels to the individual. But I think we also need to look at the broader spectrum, which is like what everyone else said.
Brilliant.
Beyond the individual.
The alarm went. There you go. Thank you so much, Graham. Luciana. Oh, you're still muted. I'll start you again.
Probably, I've not had many out-of-body experiences. That's why I study other people and interview them. From what I've had, which is the combination of sleep paralysis and the beginning of out-of-body, so different to lucid dreaming. That's what perturbed me. Lucid dreaming, I was familiar with. I'd studied it. I'd been with Stephen LaBerge. I'd been with Keith Hearn, and I've absolutely focused on it. When the out-of-body stuff happened, it was really scary. And my personal experience was something I didn't feel with lucid, which was spinning. And the spinning was scary, and it felt both haunting as well, as if there was actually ghosts in the room. And because of that fear, I became fixated on understanding the neuroscientific correlates behind that. And I'm on a path to investigating that. So that's what I can add for now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Jade, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so I would echo kind of what Anthony, David and Susan have said in terms of self-awareness or perception seeming to leave the body. But then I want to, I agree with Graham that we do need to add more to it, because you can have out-of-body experiences and then you can have out-of-body-like experiences, which don't seem to have a lot of the prominent features that someone might experience in, say, a classic out-of-body experience. So there are some subtleties and phenomenological differences, for example, between lucid dreams, out-of-body experiences, shamanic journey and DMT, and sleep paralysis and remote viewing. There's lots of different phenomenological differences. They're not all a out-of-body experience. For example, I often have a metaphor of, it's like they're all different rivers that seem to lead towards the same ocean, at least from my experience, but all the rivers have a different quality of water and direction that they're going in.
Thank you, Jade. Sorry, to the panelists, have you got gallery view? Can you see it when I give you a 10-second thing, or do you need me to say it? Oh, sorry. And I will stop interrupting and just give you the 10-second thing. Not that you'll have it again. Finally, this is a tricky one to be at the end, Oliver, but I've seen you in deep meditation for a lot of these answers. So I'm sure you'll have something deeply meditative to add to it. So whenever you're ready, your minute starts now.
Well, yeah, I don't think I'll add to the concise definitions being put forward, but what I will say is that my understanding, which maybe in experiences that aren't traditionally OBEs, but my understanding is informed by my own experiences with deeply profound hypnagogic experiences, and also with ayahuasca as well. Happy to talk about those later.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we've defined one of our central terms. We're now going to begin with one of our first questions. This first question is directed to Sue, but obviously we can open up to other panelists afterwards. The first question is, even after millennia of subjective reports and whole traditions of meditative experiences to help induce them, it wasn't actually until 1975 that the seemingly incredible phenomena of lucid dreaming was proved a scientific fact. It seems to me that out-of-body experiences are viewed in a similar way today as lucid dreaming was pre-1975, as in lots of subjective reports, lots of subjective reports and some burgeoning scientific research into the phenomena, but absolutely no widely accepted scientific proof as yet. So, Sue Blackmore, on the subject of OBEs, can you tell us something about the current scientific consensus of out-of-body experiences?
Yeah, but first I want, if it's all right, I want to pick up on the earlier bit of what you were saying there, because I agree there is a big difference between the way the research on lucid dreaming went, and it took that critical discovery that people could signal by moving their eyes when asleep and say, I'm aware, and that was the breakthrough. The difference, I think, and that was just helped enormously and took us forward. But I think there isn't the same problem with lucid dreaming as there is with out-of-body experiences. There isn't the same temptation to believe that an out-of-body, that a lucid dream, proves life after death or gives evidence of a spirit body or a soul or an astral body or anything like that. And it's that yearning in people, a huge desire, and it comes from our dualist conceptions that begin when we're little kids, that we think mind is separate from body, and that is so powerful that people go on rejecting the science of out-of-body experiences that we have. So we think that's why there's a big difference. In fact, the research on OBEs did begin around the same time. Certainly the term near-death experiences was coined then in 75. So, but I think they've gone in different ways for that reason. Now, summarizing the science of God, how long have I got? Are you going to go like this in a minute? I don't know. Tell me if I'm going on too long and I'll shut up. So the critical breakthrough was in 2002 when Olaf Blanke had a very sick epileptic patient and had to put subdural electrodes, that's underneath the skin around the actual brain, under the skull. Terrifying kind of procedure, but it means you can actually physically stimulate a very precise area of the brain. And he made the discovery that if you stimulate the right temporoparietal junction in that particular woman, he could induce and control out-of-body experiences, get her to feel she was out of her body and back down in her body and out, and so on, body distortions. Why this is so important, it's if you just find a spot that produces the experience, that doesn't really get you very far, because you might say, oh, well, that's the bit of the brain where the astral body leaves or something like that. But the reason that it's so exciting to me is because that's the part of the brain that's constructing our body schema. That is our representation of the body and where the arms are, all that you require to behave, to be a moving animal. And so the idea is that an out-of-body experience is an extreme version of a disturbing of the body schema. And lots of research has gone on since then to find out in which people who have those experiences, people whose epilepsy has a focus near that spot, are more likely to have out-of-body experiences than ones who don't. There have been some examples of epileptic kids actually describing an out-of-body experience as they're going into a seizure. There's a lot of evidence that confirms that. But if we take the wider phenomena, in the film, people talked also about tunnels and lights and so on. The tunnel is very well explained by the structure of the visual cortex, the primary visual area V1 at the back of the brain, the way it's organized. Tunnels are ubiquitous in different cultures with using various psychedelic drugs. And then the light is, well, my own theory here is that all of the parts of the near-death experience, lights, tunnels, out-of-body experience, worlds beyond, so on, are due to hyperactivity in different parts of the brain. So hyperactivity meaning instead of the brain being balanced with inhibitory and excitatory variables, it's just massive excitation, which you get near death, but you get it in many other circumstances too. So if it's in B1, you get tunnels. If it's in temporal lobe, you get memories and life reviews. If it's in the temporoparietal junction, you get out-of-body experiences. So I could go on. I think there's enough detail to show the gist of where it's going. Is each little bit we can find out how it relates to our normal sense of self. And that's really exciting to me, because all of my decades of meditation and spiritual practice and so on are really all about observing and dismantling this natural sense of self that I'm in here looking out through the eyes, which doesn't make sense in neuroscientific terms. So what's going on? The out-of-body experience is one way of revealing that it's an illusion that I was ever in there. The fact that I can perceive things as though I was out there is like, I was wrong in the beginning. The mystery of consciousness is much, much deeper than that. And it's not solved, in my opinion, by inventing astral bodies and whatever. So that's a kind of summary of where I think the science has got to. And thank goodness, serious scientists are now investigating OBEs. That did take a lot longer, as you said, than it did with lucid dreaming.
Thank you, Sue. And I'll open up to the rest of the panel. I mean, I guess my urge is towards Graham, if he'd like to respond, but also to all the panelists who'd like to respond to that question.
Well, I guess the first thing to point out there is no one here is defining anything in terms of astral bodies and silver cords, etc. So that feels a little bit of a straw man kind of angle to take on it, because we're all talking essentially about different forms of brain function, and there's some way that's probably where the out-of-body experience is arising. But the issue is whether or not there can be any perception, or whether there can actually be anything objective to the experience. It doesn't mean that it can't be brain generated, but the ideological position of whether or not it leads to that kind of thinking about astral bodies and all of that is irrelevant, because that's just a fallacy to say that, oh, it might lead to that, so therefore we shouldn't explore alternative versions of what might be going on. That's not helpful. I think what we need to do is say, what are people experiencing, and do they ever experience objective, veridical information? And in my experience, they do seem to experience veridical elements. We do have science on that. We do have science of non-local perception, like remote viewing research. I've taken part in myself, so I've seen it firsthand. And I don't agree that there isn't evidence for these kinds of things. So then we have to break down, okay, what might be going on? We can reject all of that. We can reject all of that science, all of the parapsychology, etc. But that then just becomes like a position. We can't say it's unreasonable to accept that there might be something to it. So I think for me, the the angle is I don't want to kind of dismiss any particular area. I want to explore what's going on there and see if we can actually objectively find out what might be there. We might have a model. It might be something like the schema that Sue talks about, a schema in the brain, but then maybe there's information or extension beyond the brain. So something like a computer connected to a network, to give an analogy, something like that. We don't know yet. We don't even fully understand consciousness yet. So I think it's more about trying to unravel based upon the data and based upon the experiential information that we have. So that's kind of the angle I come from. It doesn't have anything to do with astral bodies.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Thank you, Graham. Unless anyone else wants to comment on that, I'll move to the next question, which is to Anthony. Okay. So, Anthony, people having OBEs often report meeting entities. And by this, I mean seemingly objectively existing conscious beings separate from themselves. The big question is, of course, are these entities projections of our own personal subjective mind stream, or truly separately existing objective beings? So I'd like to put this question first to Anthony Peake and then open it up to the group.
This was very much the subject matter of my latest book, The Hidden Universe, because it's intrigued me for a long time that when individuals or when people have out-of-the-body experiences, near-death experiences, entheogenic facilitated experiences, they seem to encounter entities that seem to have a degree of consistency about them. Now, whether this consistency is because they are following certain subliminal archetypes that we have within our brain, or whether there is something more. Now, I personally have never had any of these experiences. I tend to describe other people's experiences of these things. But it does seem to me that there seems to be a degree of consistency in the entity's motivations, in that they seem to have been with us for an awful long time. And I'll give an example of this, which I found extraordinary. And it happened with my mother. My mother was developing Alzheimer's and dementia. And she had one morning, she phoned me up in a state of distress, whereby she claimed she'd woken up in the middle of the night and she was in a state of sleep paralysis. And she looked towards the door. She lived on her own, late 80s. And she said she saw an entity move around the edge of the door, saw 3 or 4 spindly fingers come around the edge of the door. And this head looked at her, and she described it in very precise terms. She said it had huge black insect-like eyes. She said it had 2 holes for a nose and a slit for a mouth, and it saw her and dodged backwards again. Now, what I immediately realized that what was happening with her, she was probably starting, and there was other evidence to make me believe this, that she was starting to experience Charles Bonnet syndrome. And therefore I knew that there was relationships between Charles Bonnet syndrome and early symptoms of Alzheimer's. So I managed to get a diagnosis on this. But what I was intrigued was as to the way there is this standard image. And in my book, I discussed there were a group of caves that were recently excavated in northern India that hadn't been inhabited or hadn't been open for 10,000 years. And exactly the same imagery was painted on the walls of these caves in northern India. The similar beings are found in the Junction Shelter down in South Africa in the Drakensberg Mountains. So there seems to be a consistency. Now, again, is this just some kind of archetype? But it's how we look at this. Do we think that the archetype is creating the art or not, or what is happening here? We also know that people, when they take DMT and everything else, they see, and David can come in on this, but the entities seem to be expecting them. These entities seem to know that they're coming. They seem to have separate motivations. And this very much intrigues me. And in fact, I'm now terming this the egregorial hypothesis. And I'm developing a hypothesis whereby it is both internal and external. And if we use the arguments from quantum physics, the idea that the act of observation collapses the wave function into a point particle in a particular location in space and time, could it be that in some way our external perceptions can also be reduced because of our expectations? But this doesn't necessarily mean that they are not real, because of course the whole word real is a big issue here. It's a huge subject, but that's just a very quick synopsis of my overall position on this. I genuinely don't know, but it is absolutely fascinating.
But it seems to me that what you've described makes perfect sense in terms of what our brains are for, how they've evolved. Primarily, the most important thing that our visual system has to do is detect other people and their emotions and their face. And that's why we have a specific face area in the brain that detects faces, why children concentrate on faces, why babies, even babies, will look to a particular face rather than anything else and be surprised when faces are made weird. So I think it's all generated by that. And why should they be coming to you for a reason? Because they're really part of yourself. And you're enabled by this to have a kind of experience to find out something about what's in your own mind, the same way that dreams can. I'm not really saying this is right, but I'm trying to think we don't need to go to quantum physics or anything like that. We need to look to our own minds and see what these entities are doing. You mentioned Charles Bonnet syndrome, which maybe people won't know about. I think I'm right. That's what you get with people who go blind late in life, get Charles Bonnet syndrome, don't they? And so what appears to happen there is that when the visual system doesn't have enough actual input, the brain starts to generate stuff itself. And extraordinarily, it generates just those things that you get with ayahuasca. I've seen them, you know, the little elves and pixies and the rows of things. And they could even be cars, but they come in little rows. And, you know, these things are standard products of a brain that is generating stuff from within, because it hasn't got enough input, which of course very many out-of-body experiences occur when sensory input is reduced. So again, that's not surprising that we would get those things.
Well, my argument there would be that why would my mother come up with a typical grey when she wouldn't know a grey if it bit her on the backside? Now, one could argue quite reasonably that because we are programmed to see faces, and in extremis a face could look like a grey, but her description was so precise to me, it intrigued me. Had she seen my grandfather, or had she seen a normal human being? But she didn't.
When was this though? Was it, I mean, the whole grey thing was really big in the early 90s. I made a TV program and went around meeting the people who'd, you know, been abducted by aliens and all of that. It was fascinating. But, you know, you saw them everywhere. Could it be that?
Well, my mother wouldn't have done, because I know that it was something that didn't interest her, and I know the history of the grey phenomenon, and I know effectively the archetype really started with the cover of Communion, the Whitley Strieber book. But to me, she would never have seen that. Now, whether it was some form of archetype she was seeing, I don't know. But the question still has to be asked: why a little elderly lady in the north of England was seeing images that are painted in caves in northern India and in South Africa. And to me, that is intriguing. And I think that is at least something that we need to investigate. And to just say that it is just hallucinations created by the brain, we have no real idea what hallucinations.
Oh, that's so belittling to say it's just hallucinations. All I'm saying is that the contrast is, it's intriguing. I agree. Is it the same? Because all our brains are very similar. Those people in the caves all those thousands of years ago had very similar brains, totally different culture. They didn't have written language, but the same basic brains. That's still an exciting answer to me to the intriguing question. You don't have, I don't like that it's just a hallucination. That
I agree with you. The reason I'm
another 1 minute on this panelist.
Just an hallucination is because that tends to be the standard answer, whereas I take it a step further and we don't actually know what generates hallucinations in the first place.
I agree, absolutely.
I'd like to jump in if I can, just in terms of you know, priming from the visual system, that kind of pareidolia where we're primed to see faces. There's a few kind of cases in which we may not necessarily expect that. Some of that's coming through from our DMT research with people with aphantasia who have no mental imagery. So even when they're having really intense DMT experience, they have no mental imagery whatsoever. And yet they have entity encounter like experiences with kind of, you know, super intelligent kind of deity-like beings or elves, but with no kind of visual content whatsoever. They still have these encounters. And the other one, of course, is with people who are blind, congenitally blind from birth, who wouldn't have developed that whole kind of visual system, although, you know, we might have to kind of take into account some kind of innate system going on here. But when, and then getting into the realm of near-death experiences here rather than out-of-body ones, is when they have near-death experiences, which typically involve an out-of-body experience, they have the classic out-of-body experience thing, where they feel like they're seeing their own body down below from a disembodied perspective on some occasions. And yet, you know, it certainly requires a modification of this kind of argument that they're primed to see faces because these people have never seen a face in their life. In fact, they've never seen anything. They don't even know what seeing is as an experiential thing, because they don't even perceive light or dark. They don't perceive any kind of visual phenomena whatsoever, except for on these rare occasions when they have a near-death experience and report being able to see. And your kind of classic out-of-body-like experiences. And some of these reports are coming from before the time when near-death experiences were named and known, from 1975 onwards. So we have some kind of anomalies to this, which also need to kind of fit within our great model to really explain what's going on.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Our next question is directed to Graham Nicholls. So Graham, in the documentary film Inside Out, you spoke about an OBE precognitive experience related to the 1999 Soho bombing. Can you tell us something about the relationship between precognition and out-of-body experiences?
Well, I tend to, I guess in terms of psi, or the scientific term for psychic experiences, I don't tend to divide them up in terms of telepathy, precognition, etc. I think that we tend to do that for the sake of language, but I think that probably what we're dealing with is one kind of thing that is then we experience in different ways or with different focuses, much the same way that we might experience different states of consciousness, different forms of perception, all of that kind of thing. So I think it's a part of the structure of our experience. I don't think it's that they're all divided up. So if you like, something like remote viewing or what's generally called clairvoyance might be at one end. And I think that when we go deeper into an experience, we go into different levels and different types of sensory shutdown. It's usually like as our ordinary senses shut down, we tend to get more of the hypnagogic type experiences and things like that coming to the fore. And I think, for example, in Ganzfeld experiments, which uses perceptual deprivation or mild sensory deprivation, you start to get more information coming through. And in my opinion, the research shows that there is something objective in that information. So I think on one end of the spectrum, you have something like remote viewing, and then on the other end, as it goes deeper and you're more immersed in the experience, you have something like an out-of-body experience. I mean, there's obviously a lot more mechanisms and etc. going on, but I'm just doing this in a general sense. So I think precognition is probably a key aspect within all of that psi phenomena. They're probably all interconnected, and it seems that on some level there is a precognitive aspect to psychic abilities. The research of Dean Radin, Rupert Sheldrake and Daryl Bem, etc., many others have looked into this. So this is kind of where I go in terms of that. But in terms of that experience, I don't know if that was genuinely precognitive or whether it could have been some other form. You know, it could have been some kind of telepathic information from the person who committed the event. It could have been an extraordinary coincidence. But when you put together all of the other factors of things I've experienced in my life, I have to at least be open to the possibility that that was an objective experience. So that's kind of how I contextualize precognition within a wider form of psi.
Thank you, Graham. Anyone else want to jump in on this? Precognition in relationships, out-of-body experience. David.
If Sue hasn't got a comment. I think this is really interesting, and this kind of gets to the nub of some of the questions about, okay, are you genuinely out of your body? And the only real way we could kind of verify that would be if people had some kind of veridical perception of something that was happening in, you know, the real world. In Graham's case, it happened to be an event which happened 5 days later, which is, you know, still interesting and good evidence, although slightly out of time. But it kind of suggests that it was either a precognitive or precognitive clairvoyant-like experience. And so we're getting into this whole other realm. So if people are able to have what we might call psi experiences whilst they're out of their body, are these just psi experiences? Is it just common or garden precognition or clairvoyance, and there's no actual leaving of the body at all. So it becomes a bit of a kind of paradox of, well, it's just clairvoyance or it's just precognition. You didn't really leave your body. But that still begs us to kind of explore these extraordinary experiences at face value and begin to kind of experiment with that, as you know, Sue has done, and myself. So so that, you know, leads into this other terrain of, well, is our psychic experiences genuine and real? But that's a whole other question.
You're surprised I didn't jump in, but I was holding myself back. But since you suggested it, I mean, the problem is I spent what seemed at the time a very long time as a parapsychologist investigating all these things. And I found a large group of Ganzfeld studies were definitely not done properly and probably fraud. And Daryl Bem goes on using those studies without saying where they came from and without referencing.
That's not really true, Sue.
It is.
In Dean Radin's book, he includes a meta-analysis that doesn't include the Carl
there is
Sargent,
one that doesn't include
that doesn't include this Carl Sargent research, and it was still positive for Psy. So that's not, you repeat that a lot, but the fact is that it has been done without the Carl Sargent research, which you're referring to.
I think the reason why I'm trying to hold myself back from saying anything really is because, but I will just say this, in the end, so much of what I struggled with turned to dust, and that was one of the examples. The later Ganzfeld stuff might be true, it might really be evidence for Psy, and I don't know, and I'm not going back to it all. I've just been upset by the fact that stuff that definitely shouldn't have been included has gone on appearing in books and so on like that. I don't know in the end whether there are psychic phenomena. I can only say that all of those years, everything seemed to fall apart when I really investigated it. And that's really why I should shut up, and I should never have let myself get into that.
I mean, I don't know either. I'll say I don't know either, but what I'm saying is I think that issue that you're raising there has been dealt with. And
okay, fair enough.
And I think that there's research that's happened since then. And unless I'm mistaken, you said that you stopped looking at the research in pre-95. So
yes. Well,
that's a long time ago.
I really gave up on it. Yes, I've obviously see some of it, but that's why I don't any longer do. Again, I shouldn't have said anything because up to that point, I could say that I was an expert on. I knew the data very well. I'd read so much of the literature, and after that, I didn't, and so I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it, and I certainly don't now. So really all I can say is that's why I left the field, because it became very depressing looking for it. And it was great to hand over to other people to do it, and they carried on, and good for them. I think it's important, I'll just add this, I think it's really important that Psy research carries on, because if it is true, which I don't think it is, but if it is true, it would be one of the greatest scientific discoveries, and we would really need to revolutionize so much of what we understand if it's true. So I'm really glad people are going on studying it. I'm not going to, because I never got anywhere, and I don't think I probably would if I did carry on.
That was a very exciting closing comment there, Sue. Thank you. Our next question here is to Luciana. So you work with technology and brain waves to create interactive and immersive art emulating altered states in fully awake participants using techniques involving augmented reality, strobe lights, neurofeedback, all the juicy stuff. Can you tell us, first of all, what kind of experiences do your participants report, and do any of them report full-on OBEs through the use of this technology?
Well, I've measured thousands of people's brainwaves, and through art, I've managed to interact and engage with people and stimulate or simulate, depending how you see it, a psychophenomenological experience close to an altered state. And I always have an assistant where my fee permits me to pay them. And the point is, it's so important because the EEG only shows us so much. So the brainwave recordings that I make, and I must point out in case I haven't said it, it's purely frontal lobe. I don't do multi-channel over the entire cortex. I purely record the prefrontal cortex, which is for a couple of reasons. It's easy, it's hairless, so you can apply electrodes to people without messing up their day or their evening or their scientific medical network symposium they're attending. And I'm interested in what that region shows us as well, because as we know from dichotomies and lobotomies, a sense of self can be destroyed or removed or reduced whilst epilepsy is ameliorated. So, you know, what that region of the brain actually is in fact, you know, in control of or producing is so important. What I see in people is through the strobe light and through certain programs that I design to induce an altered state. It needs at least 4 to 5 minutes. 12 is kind of an ideal entry level into an altered state. At about that point, the participant normally reports having lost all sense of time, completely underestimating how long their experience was. Remember, this is an art installation. They didn't sign up to be a clinical study. They didn't, you know, participate in a weekend-long retreat. They thought they were just having a quick little experience with their friends, maybe with a jolly glass of champagne, who knows? But there they are, suddenly in the chair, completely lost sometimes for words, not in a bad way, not like an amnesia kind of way, but at first, sometimes all they say is thank you, which is great. But I pass them to the assistant, or I go with the participant, and my assistant then carries on with the experience. And I interview them carefully with a sort of subjective report technique that was helped by David Luke, in fact, from Greenwich, to not load the questions, to ask, basically, how are you? And then ask them if they've had an experience like this before, knowing that it's a private interview. And sometimes they compare it immediately to other things they've done in their life, which may be in a rave, which may be on, an ecstatic high through dancing or something. But they normally have a benchmark, a language to compare this experience to. And I find that really fascinating. So we have the brainwave report, sometimes showing massive changes. Generally theta waves, which are quite slow, and the meditative ones. And for me, when I'm watching someone, if they also produce gamma, which is beyond beta, beyond 35 hertz, at the same time, I normally sort of start making notes whilst I'm also being the artist in a installation, because I'm getting really excited as to what this person may report. Generally, that's a higher altered state of consciousness, and the higher that gamma goes, really, I hope to hear more of a journey. It's not always the way, though. Maybe the person just doesn't know how to describe it. What I've learned, though, is I feel really responsible for all the participants. I don't just want to have them, give them a trip, and then put them back out into, into Shoreditch or wherever for the night, and never hear from them again. So I'm kind of working now how I can make a kind of decompression chamber where we can keep in touch. Do they want to? I care, but it's sort of part of the whole interactive art. They're not just another person through, the ride. And I ask their permission if I can record their voice, purely so their stories sometimes can be woven back in to the actual experience for future participants.
Oh, that's cool.
So you may have heard, if you've ever tried my work, the narrative about 5 nuns in a canoe, because that was immediately given to me by one participant. He said, I don't even dream. I don't have lucid dreams. I won't even have a hypnagogic or whatever you're saying experience in 10 minutes in your dentist chair. So first of all, I had to say, just relax. It's not competitive. Your partner's watching you, filming, And he got out the chair. It was this particular person, particularly stubborn, kind of, let's say, bit of ego going on. He was quiet. And then he said, a log was dancing in front of me. And then these 5 nuns in the canoe kind of just went by. Wonderful. I'm so jealous. So, it's like little gems like that then get put back into the sonic story, which other people might trigger. It's all part of the artwork.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I've experienced some of your work, and it's brilliant. And the future of it fascinates me too. It kind of excites me of where this work's going. I know you've been in the field for a long time now, and it continues to evolve. Thank you for that. Next question is for Dr. Ollie Robinson. So some people report spontaneous OBEs at times of major life transition. Why do you think this is? And are there any potential risks when this occurs?
Well, certainly the cause-effect relationship there is tricky because, of course, out-of-body experiences are so transformative in themselves and can quite easily and often do stimulate life transitions. Off the back of one, someone might decide to change their career, redesign their life, and we've already heard from people on this panel for whom that is arguably the case. So there's that as a key element, which is that the out-of-body experience might precede the big transition. But equally, life transitions are very destabilizing. You go from a position of stability and relative order and a sort of structured, stable model where all parts interrelate in a coherent whole that defines your life, into one where all the parts are kind of up in the air and they're all falling, and like the house of cards, you pull out one and the whole lot tends to fall down because our lives are super interdependent. One bit changes and everything else cascades. And I think there's a kind of vernacular in psychology where we refer to instability as sort of inherently negative, stability is negative. Of course, instability is profoundly important in some ways, because if you create an unstable system, if you create a dynamic and fluid system where the parts don't cohere, I think you're open to insights in a way that you're not normally. It's like, the cracks allow the light in some way. Mind you, there's a pathological interpretation of it. Sue's model of OBEs from back in the 1990s, you go from a sort of coherent model where there's a sort of a clear, singular, sane sense of what's going on, into one which is more fragmented, and thus you can have a sense, more likely to have a sense of intrusion into your own reality from sort of some part of self that's excluded from the dominant model. But that's a way of looking at it as well. But yes, so from what I've researched, these times of instability and transition are times of insight, as well as heightened vulnerability as well. And it's a kind of, and if you speak to people after crisis, it's quite easy to kind of come away with a sense that these transitional experiences, they lead to growth and everything pans out well, because it's those people who come and chat to you about them. You get a self-selection effect where the people who provide the data are people with a good story to tell, and the people who kind of crumbled out of them, they just don't come and chat. But I did research where that bias was less prevalent, and I realized that actually almost all life transitions have a really close admixture of sort of pleasure and pain, of opportunity and danger, whether that's having a child, transitioning out of university into work, or out of work into unemployment, or indeed menopause, for example, things like this. All these things have a deeply paradoxical mixture of elements. And so back to the OBE. So if we see the OBE as one where the body-mind, or at least that the body-mind unity as it's consistently experienced, gets ruptured in some way, in the sense that your entire life world is ruptured. So I think you're sort of more open to experiencing those disentanglements. And I'm personally very open to the veridical nature of OBEs, as in the sense that there is an aspect of the human being that is not purely the physical body, and that can become disentangled from the physical.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ollie. Would anybody else like to jump in on that question?
I'd like to just mention about some of my participants, following on from that, from my research. All of them around there. So I looked at people who were healthy, that had spontaneous out-of-body experiences, so they didn't have a pathological condition. And at the time, or around the time of their out-of-body experience, there's a spectrum. So some are a few days before, a few weeks before, and a few months before, there was some sort of major life transition or emotional overwhelm, positive or perceived as negative, and they had a spontaneous out-of-body experience. So there's spontaneous, forced, and self-induced. And from the spontaneous ones, they retrieved some sort of information, whether it was an insight, a realization, or they met an entity, or they had something where it aided their life situation. And I can't remember who said it, but there was a theory that potentially spontaneous OBEs could be a way for the psyche to create a homeostasis within itself, but also it could be that a spontaneous OBE is a way for the psyche to self-actualize a new emerging sense of self into being, due to the life circumstances that are happening. And it certainly seems that, I know it's not for everybody, but for the ones that I were looking at, that's what they experienced. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you. If there's nobody else, we'll move on to a question for David. Okay, so Dr. David, you've done a lot of research into DMT, psilocybin, ketamine. Can you tell us about the connections, if any, between the psychedelic experiences elicited by these substances and out-of-body experiences?
Yeah, so, these substances can very much induce out-of-body-like experiences, particularly ketamine. I think that one probably wins hands down as the kind of royal road to an out-of-body experience at the right dosage. I'd say it's probably pretty much guaranteed, although it isn't your classic kind of spontaneous or forced or intended body experience, in that you may find, for instance, you're in several different places at the same time. It's often, kind of hyper-real and quite strange, but, you can get your classic veridical out-of-body kind of experience where you're just in the room looking at what's going on, or maybe you're walking down the street and you find you're looking backwards out of your body and realize you're not actually in your body anymore. Or whereas DMT is probably more akin to the kind of near-death experience. I think out-of-body experiences happen more with ketamine, but in DMT you kind of get a disembodied experience, but you're not really in this kind of classic space where you're in consensus reality, or it seems like you're in consensus reality. You tend to be in a kind of another world kind of experience, and maps closely to the near-death experience in some respects, because you have encounters with, spiritual beings. You maybe even get the sound, this kind of tearing, ripping, whirring sound, as you kind of get this out-of-body disembodiment experience. And in some cases, you do get meetings with deceased relatives. They don't happen very often, about 5% of cases in our current research. Very occasionally you get a life review, maybe about less than 5% of cases. So they have some similarities in near-death experiences, but they have a lot of differences as well. The big differences are that with DMT, you get a lot of this kind of very, very colourful, complex geometry going on, which you don't tend to get with near-death or out-of-body experiences, though we do occasionally. And also, the kind of beings you tend to meet on DMT are not your classic near-death or out-of-body kind of beings, kind of elves, clowns, reptiles, giant praying mantises doing kind of weird experiments on you, aliens, and occasionally in Rick Strassman's research, crocodiles, which then go on to rape you. That was kind of just a one-off experience, I understand. So, they're not your classic kind of cases, but there is a lot of overlap and similarity. And if you administer a near-death experience scale to people who've just had a DMT experience, it'll tick all the same boxes, because the kind of the psychometric measures are kind of quite general and somewhat crude. So on paper, it looks like the same kind of experience, but when you dig into the nuances, as we're doing currently, myself and my PhD student, Pascal Michael, you're looking at the phenomenology, the actual content of the experiences and the kind of things that occur. There are some kind of quite distinct differences. So I think these substances can give us some insights into our body and near-death experiences, but I don't think it's a one-to-one relationship. And in the case of DMT, it's particularly interesting because it's naturally occurring in the human body, probably occurs in the brain. There's some recent experiments done with euthanized mice and found a kind of massive upsurge in the amount of DMT in their brains at the point of death, like a 6-fold increase. So, there's possibly some overlap, but it's not, it's not a complete model, if you like. But I think it does start to give us some parts of this neurobiological jigsaw puzzle. And at the end of the day, these are only kind of, the brain processes involved in these experiences. It doesn't necessarily give us an ultimate explanation of these experiences. They're just the neurobiology is part of the process, but is not the same thing as the experience, right? The experience is something else. This is in the realm of phenomenology and consciousness. And so there's still a lot of questions and unanswered gaps in our understanding that still deserve to be kind of explored, and probably will be for quite a long time. I'll probably leave it there because
I'm really fascinated. Sorry, had you finished? I'm really fascinated to hear that general research, because I should have read more of the research you're doing, I guess. But I've done this on a very personal level, trying to answer that question. Obviously, having had the dramatic out-of-body experience I had, you know, as a student, I have been interested in the whole drugs question. So all of the drugs you've mentioned, I've tried to see how they relate to out-of-body experiences. So I have had a brief out-of-body experience with LSD, as many people do, but it's, you know, LSD, as you said, that's not the royal road. Ketamine, I had deliberately to try to induce an out-of-body experience. And I was very lucky. I had a friend in a country where it was not as illegal as here, and I had a just sub-anesthetic dose, so I was completely paralyzed except for my eyes, lying in a warm waterbed with quad sound. It was just a lovely situation, which, you know, it really helps if you take some of these really difficult drugs in nice situations. And I did seem to go out of the body, and I could only move my eyes, so I had this absolute sense of that my body wasn't really there at all. It was weird. And I did try to go to my house back in England and see what was happening there, and I wrote it all down afterwards, and it was completely wrong. Which perhaps didn't surprise me that much. But more important is it did not feel like the spontaneous OBE that I'd had at all. It didn't have that extraordinary vividness and controllability, and I don't know, it just didn't feel the same at all. DMT is very interesting. I've had DMT in 3 different forms. Smoked, I had that, and the guy who helped me to have that said, I need to tell you before you do this that it's like an LSD trip of, you know, 10 hours or whatever, condensed into 15 minutes. And the last person I had it with said that it was so terrible, it was the worst, it was so bad that he thought during the experience that nothing that could ever happen in his life afterwards would make it all right. So that was a good introduction to the drug you're just about to take. And it was horrendous. It was like screaming that I was sitting on the floor looking at the legs of this table, which are kind of curly legs, and they just kind of went round like barber poles, green and orange, and then there were kind of rats and penises and chains and horrible things kind of all going orange and green, and this terrible noise you described, absolutely horrendous. Didn't last very long, and all the time apparently I was going with a big grin on my face going, terrible. That was the smoked. I've had ayahuasca now 8 times, and I agree. I mean, extraordinary geometrical things. The worst thing, I always talk about the worst things. They were wonderful things, but when I turned into a snake, and it was like being completely trapped and squeezed into being a snake, it was, I needed help of the guide to help me with that one. But amazing visions. But the final time that I had it was an extraordinary chemist produces it inhaled from a bag. So it's inhaled, not smoked, vaporized DMT. And he gave the advice, amazing advice. He said, you've got to he said, the door to DMT is very, very narrow, and you have to make yourself very small. Now, I've done, you know, with a lot of meditation practice and jhanas practice and out-of-body practice and other things, I'm kind of used to manipulating my body feelings. So I made myself extremely small and went into the void, and was able to go in and out because you could have this bag, and if you wanted some more, it would last 5-10 minutes. And if you wanted some more, you put your hand up and he'd bring the bag and you have some more. It was an extraordinarily, I'm really grateful to have had that experience of controllable DMT that way. Now, returning to the purpose why we're here, I would agree with what's been said by others here. None of those DMT experiences were like an out-of-body experience. None of them would fit my definition as an experience in which you perceive the world from a location outside your physical body. It was just other worlds. Worlds of plants and animals and forests and geometrical shapes and moving through scenes, cities, extraordinary kind of constructions, like some of the astral projectors like Sylvan Muldoon and Iram, and those people describe those things in some experiences, but otherwise I think really no connection with OBEs.
Thank you, Sue. David, was there a point there where you just picked up an ayahuasca vine or part of the active ingredient?
Could be. I'm going to wave it around every time anyone says ayahuasca.
Oh, I've got one too, and I've got, yeah, I've got
I will add that while Sue's running off to get her ayahuasca stash, that on some occasions, you know, there are some experiences which can be very OB love. One of my own experiences, very nice, Sue. Oh, yours is bigger than mine. You win.
Yeah, huge. I don't think it is really.
I will have just quickly one experience that I recount my own, which was with Benylin, which was contains DXM, which is kind of a cousin of ketamine. And I drank a bottle from my rather terribly chesty cough, and unexpectedly had an out-of-body experience when I got up to go to the toilet. And I tried going through the toilet door, and I just couldn't get through the door. And then I looked kind of like to my right, and I saw my body 6 feet to the right of me, and I was kind of like extremely confused. And so I was like, oh, I'm having an out-of-body experience. So I had to shuffle my perspective. My perspective was here, but my body was over there. And I had to kind of get my body to shuffle 6 feet to the left so I could get into the toilet to go for a pee. I won't tell you what happened when I actually got in there, but it was a terrible mess. Hard enough at the best of times. But that was one of those extraordinary experiences where, you know, it came by surprise, and yet I had this kind of seemingly veridical perception from a disembodied perspective, which I was not anticipating. But I don't recommend it if you value your cleanliness of your toilet.
So if you can't get yourself to the Amazonian jungle to take ayahuasca, you can always get down to Boots and get yourself a bottle of Benylin, right? Wow.
Not the
That's what I'm not going to try.
Okay, thank you, panelists. We have a final question now, or for this section, is for Jade. So I know personally that you've just pulled an all-nighter to get in a funding application to explore treating death anxiety with virtual reality and OBEs. So it seems like there's definite scope for using out-of-body experiences therapeutically. Can you tell us something about how OBEs can be used as a therapeutic tool?
You're muted.
Jade, you're muted.
Okay, I can do interpretive movement to demonstrate it if that happens.
Okay.
And we have no mic. One moment, I've got the Mac computer spinning wheel of death icon happening at the right, it's gone. So yes, we can self-induce an out-of-body experience, not from drugs, from going into an altered state, and we can also have a lot of benefits from out-of-body-like experiences, which has been mentioned as well. So in the workshops that I teach, I generally sort of teach it for a general well-being. So some people would come and they would have a strong intention and a meaningful motivation, and we would create a projection plan and then learn how to implement an out-of-body experience. And it's interesting what David said then about he got up off his chair and went to the door, because we have techniques to be able to get through the wall and also be able to have more clarity in the experience and make it longer. So there's ways that you can actually manage and navigate these experiences once you're out of body. So yeah, so they would have a plan. A lot of people use it for healing grief. A lot of people use it for retrieving insights and having realizations about the next step in their life, a problem that they have in their life. Also, I look at transforming fears. So this is like using shadow work, or Jungian's idea of the shadow, in order to do work very similar to shamanism, actually. This idea of soul retrieval, or retrieving aspects of your psyche that may have split off due to trauma and such things within the out-of-body experience. So we can use it to aid our kind of everyday life in that kind of sense. But really, one of the most, I would say, benefits that's reported, that I think is one of the most important, is this decrease in death anxiety that we have. And this is often because when people have an out-of-body experience, a lot of them come back with the belief that they are more than the physical body. So there's this transcendence of the primary identification with the physical body. So they now don't believe they're a limited body or a limited sense of self, but they do now believe that they are an eternal soul, or when they die, there'll be a continuation of consciousness. And so this is a little bit like, some people have a sense of dying before they've died, which is what Stanislav Grof said. And he said, you know, it can be deeply influencing quality of life, reducing irrational fears, and increasing ability to live in the present. And we know that studies by the terror management theory researchers show that people change their behavioral responses and increase their defense mechanisms when they get triggered by death. So we know also that there's this paradox between death awareness and living a full life. If we don't fully experience emotions, fully engage in relationships, fully enter into situations, fully live life, if unconsciously we have a giant aversion to death, or we deny that we are going to die, because we are all born to die. So unless we really meet that in a way that is kind and compassionate, we won't really, arguably, be able to live the full extent of a quality life, some would say. So OBEs can be used to help treat thanatophobia, which is people that fear death or dying, or have more milder forms of death anxiety. And also people with terminal illness can get a lot of benefit from it. Actually, people can get a lot of benefit just from hearing other people's out-of-body experiences. And in particular, there was a study that showed that when people heard about near-death experiences, it impacted them in a positive way. So I think if someone's diagnosed with a terminal illness, it can benefit them just to hear stories, but also if they would like to do a practice, it can help them, and not in a way where it needs to influence their beliefs or change anything, but just in this sense of meeting their mortality in a way, this sense of dying before you've died, and meeting your own death, as I mentioned earlier. And studies have actually shown that if you have a virtual out-of-body-like experience where perception is shifted to an avatar, if you like, people have had a reduction in the fear of death. So that's not even having a full-blown OBE, that's just having a kind of a virtual reality OBE, if you like. And so the funding is for to test with two groups. One is in palliative care settings, and the other is with people with thanatophobia, fear of death or dying, and it's looking at using virtual reality, bespoke program. So some of it will be inducing an out-of-body experience or elements of an out-of-body-like experience, but then other elements will be just how can it meet the needs of people who are dying. And then that's held within a mindfulness container, which is called Mindfulness 360, which is how can we make this safe, ethical, and to the best benefit for people. So that's what the funding's for, fingers crossed. But there's actually not been loads of studies on self-initiated out-of-body experiences. There's been some therapeutic ones through self-hypnosis, and that's had positive results, but there's not much data. So I can only tell you what I know from teaching and from the virtual reality studies, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jade.
Okay.
There is one more question that I'd like to put to all the panelists, and we've only got about 10 minutes for it because I need to make sure that just after 9 we have a short 10-minute break and then come back for at least 45 minutes of questions from the floor, from the people who are watching, from the audience members. But we can spend the last up to 10 minutes looking at this question, which is, the study of consciousness is still in its infancy, in the West at least anyway. Where would you like to see the study of consciousness go in the next 20 years from here? And I open that up to anybody.
Well, I suppose I'll come in first and say that I think we are at a point of probably a change in the paradigm of science, in the sense that I'm reminded of the circumstances we had in around about the 1890s, where there was a degree of hubris happening, where people were saying that, we only need, as Nicholls said, we only need to calculate to the next 6th decimal point because we know everything there is to know. And I'm particularly pointing this out because there was something on Facebook today where Carroll, the American astrophysicist, I think, made some general statement to say that effectively we can understand everything about consciousness, how the brain works, and everything else as well. And what I'd like to believe is that science will start to open up a little bit more, and research that people like Sue was doing and everybody else, because I think we all agree with Sue that the brain is a fascinating thing. and how we'll be moving towards understanding exactly how consciousness fits in a model scientific model, and the way in which consciousness can be included within our overall understanding of the nature of reality. And I think that's where we're going to move, and I think that's where certain advances are likely to be made by using science to understand how the brain works. But it's going to take kind of leaps of intuition maybe in order to get there, because I think the problem is materialist reductionist science is taking the brain apart, but effectively taking the brain apart is like taking apart a car engine to find speed. We're looking for the wrong things in the wrong way. And I think that's the way forward. And I think it's science that will take us forward. And I think maybe it could be extremely exciting time if we do that.
I think it's bound to be exciting. The neuroscience is going to carry on, and it's doing brilliantly at doing what you said, taking apart the car or whatever. And that will carry on. I think most of the research is deeply misguided. And for example, the search for the neural correlates of consciousness is kind of fundamental part of consciousness research at the moment, and it implies that, you know, we'll find some bit of the brain or some process going on or something about what's happening in the brain that will be where consciousness is produced or consciousness is generated or something. That is fundamentally a dualist view. It's the idea that, you know, there's matter in a brain and it produces subjective experience. I mean, that the problem of dualism is thousands of years old and we haven't solved it. How are we going to get from where we are now? I'm absolutely in favor of the neuroscience doing everything it can because it's fantastic, but not to think it's going to solve consciousness by finding where it's produced. So what are we going to do instead? What I would like to see, and it's beginning very much, is a combination of objective research of that kind and subjective research. The people, long-term meditators, people who have a lot of experience of drugs, those are things we've been talking about here, people who have a lot of experiences of all sorts of different kinds. Because there are many mystical traditions, including Zen, which is where my own training is, though I'm not a Buddhist, which are fundamentally non-dualist. There are non-dual traditions, non-dual experiences, non-dual understanding of the world. My own experience suggests to me that I've had many non-dual experiences and I go, of course, it's all one. And then kind of come back to logical thinking, and I can't see how that relates to the brain stuff that we're learning. But that somehow we have to escape dualism, and at the moment the science of consciousness is failing to do that. The hard problem is constantly, we've got to solve the hard problem, and the hard problem is defined as the question of how subjective experiences arise from objective brain activity. If you put it that way, you're already in a dualist position, as indeed Dave Chalmers, who invented the term, the hard problem of consciousness, is a kind of dualist. So that's where I'm hoping some big changes in paradigm, as Anthony suggested, will come from, is that coming together of the neuroscientists and the philosophers with the practitioners of experience, self-exploration.
Thank you, Sue. Anybody else on this question? Where would you like to see consciousness research going over the next 20 years?
I'd just like to say I agree with that, looking at the subjective, but I guess the things that also are making me most excited with consciousness research is the predictive models that are starting to come forward. For example, the integrated information theory, which is one of the models out there. I'm not saying that's the only one, but for example, with that, they're starting to make predictions about the structure and forms that consciousness might arise in. So for example, they're looking at a computer and trying to assess whether that could potentially have consciousness and things like this. And I think, I'm not saying that's specifically the model that I think is right. I'm just saying that I think that moving towards more predictive models is a really interesting, I think it's where we need to go to start understanding what might be correct. I think Dan Dennett's also talked about some other models that are starting to show predictions that seem to be coming to be true. So I think that's a good angle to focus on.
Thanks, Graham. Luciana wanted to jump in, I think.
Just really briefly, another dog. Obviously, I follow a lot of sci-fi fiction and films, and as an artist, I think we have a responsibility to, you know, create these futures from something like Persinger's helmet, which could directly create, you know, an experience of a godlike, you know, experience in an atheist. And Jade's recent article being discussed in a really common newspaper as a future maybe holiday. The future of tourism is currently completely being crushed by, you know, this pandemic. Maybe future tourism combined with art, combined with neuroscience, could be as brief as an experience in a clinic and something you book into, you know, a combination of films you've already seen that you kind of amalgamate into a future hybrid version of an OBE as a holiday with a meaningful outcome. So that's kind of my provocation.
Wow, that's cool. We got time for something from David?
Yeah, I'd kind of agree with Sue in saying that, you know, looking for the correlates of consciousness through brain imaging, etc., is, you know, it kind of leads to a kind of infinite regress and becomes like a kind of high-tech phrenology, really. You know, we become kind of neuro-obsessed. But, you know, there are some kind of, we need to bring philosophy to bear. And also, you know, science progresses through anomalies, you know, things that don't fit models. So you can do all your modeling you like and predictive coding and all the rest of it. But if we look at those kind of good verification for them, which kind of indicate that consciousness transcends the brain and transcends even time and space as well, then that forces us to kind of view, you know, the entirety of the data and kind of fit that into our models. So currently, you know, the neuroscientific endeavor just kind of, it's restricting the kind of questions it even asks. It doesn't want to know about the anomalies. It wants to kind of just, you know, sweep those away because they don't fit very easily with the kind of brain-based consciousness model. So we have to do open science. We have to kind of really openly and honestly look at all the really super strange phenomena of human consciousness and bring those to the table and explore them for what kind of new discoveries we can make about reality and consciousness itself.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Because we've heard from everyone, would then Oliver or Jade like to jump in before our break?
Yeah, so I'd like to see more meeting, I mean, while I'm by no means wedded to the scientific process of acquiring knowledge as a preeminent one, I think it's one of a number. Within science, I'd like to see more dialogue and more integration between physics and biology and neuroscience. I think it's been a long time since physics has assumed that entities like human beings or molecules or indeed anything else in the manifest world are objects located at a specific point in space and time and nothing else, which seems to be the working premise for most of biology and neuroscience as well, that the object remains preeminent. And as I say, in physics, that's simply not the case. And so I would like to see neuroscience and biology take more on board the notion of what things actually are in terms of the organized entities from quanta up to the cosmos as a whole, and indeed how space and time are construed in physics, and actually recognize that and stop calling out things as non-scientific that actually are entirely congruent with a lot of what physics construes by way of what things are. I mean, you know, one could pick out some specific examples. I don't know if I've got time before the break. I could do it in a minute.
Yeah.
Which is a wave-particle duality. That was initially thought to be a thing that was pertains to quanta only, such as electrons and photons, very, you know, of submolecular things. That something could be both a wave and a particle simultaneously. But we now know that very large molecules, almost as big as viruses, show wave-particle duality. In other words, can be both particles located at a specific point in space and time, and also a wave, which in other words is smudged out through space and time. And it's illogical to state that at some point in the organization of reality that things simply stop having that duality. But, you know, you go up through very large molecules and into cells, which, by the way, most physicists think probably do have that dual nature, and then up, of course, into human beings and other organized biology. So I think that recognizing that deep paradox, which it is, because waves and particles behave very differently and relate to space and time very differently, and bringing that into the sciences of life will be helpful.
Wow, that was super cool, man. I mean, a lot of what people have said have blown my mind today, but that was particularly mind-blowing insight. For what it's worth, my tiny mind probably is blown easier than most other people. But anyway, Jade, would you like to add anything before we go for our break?
No, I don't want to add anything, but I just want to say I'm super interested in that, Oliver. And yeah, physics applied to consciousness. I almost did a course looking at that because it's just super fascinating. So I'd like to hear more at that at some point.
Okay, then in that case, everybody watching, our 150 audience members tuned in, and our panelists, we're going to have a 10-minute break now, a comfort break, they refer to it nowadays, which means I think you can go for a pee and go for a cup of tea, whatever you need to do. Let your puppies out. People are enjoying the dogs. I've seen the chat. People are saying they like
What
the dogs.
about my cat?
Oh, I think they did love your cat too, Sue. I didn't see that come up. We might have some more dog people here than cat people, but I'm sure Sue's cat is also loved. So if you've got any pets, I want to bring them back for the second half. So I have a 10-minute break now. We'll switch off our, if you want, you can switch off your cameras and mute yourselves. We'll be back in 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes, be sure to check out the Q&A box and vote up the questions that you would like answered. And Amir from Psychedelic Society will be chairing those questions when we come back. So we'll see you in 10 minutes, which will be 17 minutes past 9.
Can I just say something? Because of my chronic fatigue, I don't think I'm going to make it till 10 o'clock. I will just stay for a couple of questions, and then if you don't mind, I will just disappear. So I'll sort of say goodbye now, and I'll disappear when I feel I really have to.
Absolutely. Okay, perfect. And if there are any questions particularly for Sue, then can we pop those to the front of the pile?
That would be great. That would be really helpful. Thank you. Sorry to be a bit pathetic.
No problem. See you in 10.
Thanks.
Jade, can you hear me? So we're not back from the break, but there's several questions on how people can learn to induce OBEs. So I reckon it's useful if perhaps we say we'll send out resources, because obviously you just did a 4-week course that's just the tip of the iceberg. So rather than trying to, I don't know, maybe there's a quick answer as well, but I wonder if collating those questions and thinking, okay, we can send out some resource and emails how people can continue to investigate.
Yeah, I think we're going to get information off everyone generally, like a few different links. Some Luciana and Sue have already sent me some already, so that we have each speaker and then links for each speaker. And so obviously, like Graham and I both teach the out-of-body experience practice, so we can send links to our courses.
Great.
Charlie's going to say something about that as well.
Great.
I think you just said it.
Oh.
I will say it again when people come back. It's 9:17, so we should get going if we want to stay on target. So are you cool to field these questions, Amir? So it'll be you who's choosing and asking the questions on behalf of these audience members.
Yeah, and just to say, in these situations, there's already 52 questions, and as you saw, like one question that, you know, we could easily just pick one of these questions and spend the next 40 minutes, if not the next 40 lifetimes, discussing that one question. So I definitely won't have time to go through all of them. And so rather than adding more questions, you're better off voting up existing questions, seeing there's a few different topics already covered. You're more likely to see your area of interest covered that way. And just to say, I'll tend to just go with the ones that have the most votes, unless it's very similar to another one that's already being answered. Unless it's kind of been really gone into quite a lot in the film. So some of you may not have seen the film yet, but you all have the link. So if the film kind of potentially, if I feel like the film has really gone into one of your questions, then I'll just assume you'll be watching the film at some point. And there'll be resources sent out. So some questions are quite specific, and we'll send some resources out by email to everyone who's attended this. So I'll just go with the top question, 17 votes from Saskia. And she's saying she heard in the movie, so it's a question from the movie, that people having sleep paralysis are sitting on a gold mine. Could any of you develop on this? And some people have answered in the Q&A already that it's a good position from which to do OBEs, but maybe there's more links there or something interesting to come out of that as well.
I'll say something because I'm going to disappear in a minute. Yes, I think the reason why you can get to an out-of-body experience from sleep paralysis is because, well, if you don't know about sleep paralysis, when you're dreaming, your muscles, your skeletal muscles are all paralyzed, chemically disconnected, so you can't act out your dreams. And so-called sleep paralysis occurs when you're half awake enough to think what's happening, and you can't move. So it's a perfectly normal thing to happen. It happens to about, surveys vary, but about 40% of the population have had it at least once, and some people get it a lot. Now, if you take the view that an OBE is caused by a disruption of the body image, the fact that you're paralyzed means if you imagine moving, you have one body schema for movement is moving, and actually you stay still and you don't move, so you get the disconnect. And it's an opportunity, if you stick with it, concentrate on the idea of moving. There are techniques like rolling out or floating up, climbing a rope, whatever, which are all using that. And with your body paralyzed, it gives you a really good start. So yeah, you can enjoy it. It can be terrifying. I'm so pleased when I can help people and say, look, it's quite normal and so on, you know, enjoy it. Don't panic. And it's a great opportunity to have out-of-body experiences and explore them.
I personally tend to advise people that I teach away from sleep paralysis, because I tend to find that the quality of experiences are much lower from sleep paralysis. I tend to consider that maybe they're a different kind of experience altogether. Although they may have, like, many of the qualities of an out-of-body experience, they're kind of the same way they have many of the qualities of being in the room with a strange figure, but it doesn't mean that it's the same thing as being in the room with a figure. So it's kind of, there's the quality of the experiences always seems to come through to be lower, and more fearful entities and strange things seem to be more common in sleep paralysis experiences. So it's not a way that I tend to favor, although yes, people do have unusual experiences through sleep paralysis.
Shall I come in with the next question? So there's quite a few people asking, is OBE something you can develop and learn similar to lucid dreaming? If so, how do you do it? What methods are recommended other than just pure chance? Questions like that. So I mentioned earlier we'll send some resources out about that, but just want to check if anyone wants to give a short answer to that now as well in terms of starting points.
I can give a really short answer. So I teach it within the hypnagogic and hypnopompic state, which is when we're falling asleep and waking up from sleep. And obviously there's a tendency here to drop into a lucid dream, so the wild technique, waking-induced lucid dream, or to just be wide awake. I call it the hypnagogic highway. So we can either just black out and fall asleep, be conscious and go into a lucid dream, or go into sleep paralysis, or we can then go into an out-of-body experience. So it's easiest to practice it here because we have 2 opportunities every day, because we all go to sleep and we all wake up. So it's just easier. But I want to point out Graham, because he teaches it from completely wide awake. So still going into a trance state, but not from the sleep states. And I just think that's a really nice angle. I don't know if you want to elaborate a bit more, Graham.
I guess that Sue might find this interesting or have some comments on this, but I tend to feel that the pre-OBE state, especially when it happens from a waking state, is related to a flow state. I think that possibly when the brain is flooded with 5 neurochemicals. Essentially, when you're in a flow state, you lose a sense of time, you go into hyper-focus, you become hyper-creative, able to do things and function on a much higher level. In my work, I've tended to notice that there's something akin to that, of some form, that seems to be the pre-state to an OBE. So I tend to focus on the pre-state, which I guess is similar to the idea that when you're in sleep paralysis, you're in the right kind of pre-state for the experience. But the problem with sleep paralysis, it comes with all the extra baggage that we don't want. So doing it from a waking state and going through flow states and using mild sensory deprivation, etc., those kinds of ways are avenues to get to an OBE from a waking state, and that's what I teach.
Yeah, I do indeed find that interesting, and particularly I hadn't heard this thought about the more positive one starting from the waking state. I can get to that kind of pre-state, but I can't deliberately produce out-of-body experiences. So it's interesting to hear this. Thank you.
So there's a question. I'm going to combine 2 or 3 questions which kind of feel like they come together under the same theme. The one that I'll read one out and then say how it relates to several others that have come up. Is there a way to distinguish if characters / energies we meet in OBE are our own projections and therefore part of our mind, or something coming from somewhere outside of ourselves? That's something that's been touched on. Other questions related to that were on what other theories that perhaps haven't been mentioned on, like why. So there's a conversation that was even happening before I think the panel even started, of the different theories on why these archetypes seem to exist across different cultures. And I'll just feed in another angle on this, which some people are reporting commonly having negative experiences or meeting malevolent entities. Is this a concern? Are there any tips on how to deal with meeting malevolent entities? Are there any dangers around this? So I just thought I'd try and combine, and then maybe there'll be lots of people to.
I'm sure you're going to get lots of great answers to that one, but I think I really need to go to bed or I'll make myself ill. I've enjoyed this so much more. Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed this really a lot. Thank you all very much. It's been great, and I hope you enjoy the last half hour. Sorry to leave.
Thanks so much,
Dr.
Bye bye.
It's good to see you again.
Thank you all. Bye.
Okay, and an answer to that question, who'd like to jump in?
Well, I suppose I could come in as a starting point, in the sense of what I've been researching and writing about for the last 3 or 4 years is very much the role of these entities and what they are and what they're not. And rather similar to my point I was making earlier on with regards to my book on time, I ended up being probably as confused when I started as when I finished as to the true nature of them. But there does seem to be some kind of feedback relationship between our own anticipations and the entities that we encounter. And it does seem to me that this is why I'm using the term egregorial in the idea of the egregore, that is a thought form that can be created by a group of individuals, or we can create ourselves. But the entities seem to use our thought patterns to bring themselves into existence in some way. How this works, I'm not quite sure. But it does seem from the evidence of researchers into the subject, I'm not saying scientific researchers, but I'm saying researchers such as Paulino in America, who argue that these entities do have external reality to ourselves, and that in some way they feed off our fears and they generate fear in ourselves in order to feed off those. Now, I don't know how true that is, and I will leave that to the experts in the group as to how powerful that analogy is. But it does seem that sometimes the entities seem to be able to be independent of us and bring information to us that is not from ourselves, which suggests that there is a degree of independence going in there. And I'd be interested very much from my own point of view as to what you guys make of that as well.
With regards to the directly to the question, which is how do you, I mean, maybe restate it, but I think it was how do you distinguish between entities that may be aspects of self or generally other than, or experienced as such? You know, how do you differentially interact with them or something like that? I mean, my inclination is that you interact, no matter how you interpret the entity in front of you, whether it's as an aspect of self or as fundamentally other to the self, you interact with it in the same way, which is to try and find out what information it has for you. Now, that sentence can be interpreted a number of ways. If you think of the you as actually a limited conception of self, so you're asking that you may be part of an expanded conception of me, so you may represent some aspect of me, and I'm trying to draw that down into this conscious limited bubble. Or you could conceive it as something that's fundamentally other. And of course, just to throw out there, and I'm sure many people, participants and attendees, will resonate with the fact that actually that distinction between self and non-self doesn't really work in those states of consciousness, and that they're both self and not self. That actually the distinction between self and not self, between inner and outer, sort of vaporizes in unusual states of consciousness, such that you interact with entities that are both you and not you simultaneously.
I think that's a brilliant answer, Ollie. I couldn't really add much more to that other than say, in kind of psychedelic psychotherapy, they tend to advise you to go into it. You know, whatever fear, demon, being, whatever pops up, is to just kind of, instead of turning away from it, to go towards it, to kind of literally go into it, you know, to just see what it's composed of, and move towards it. And it typically then, according to theory, then becomes something else, it transforms. So that's one good bit of advice, although I've yet to put it into practice myself, because like you say, in these kind of deep transpersonal states, you know, it can be quite difficult to keep your bearings in what's going on, and, you know, find those distinctions between self and other. So that's one advice.
I think even the distinction of self, it comes back to the question we were talking about with consciousness, the distinction of what is the self, what is consciousness, what is actually perceiving, what is the I, all of that comes to the fore. So then if we're talking about experiencing some kind of other in an altered state, can we really even draw these distinctions? It becomes very, very complicated. And going back to what Anthony was saying about the theory of sort of fear, I tend to think that a lot of these patterns or structures, constructs, whatever that that you can experience in these kinds of altered states, often people attach that they feed off of fear and things like that. But I think another way of looking at it is that they are the result of intensity or intense emotional experience. The more that you have an intense experience of that particular concept or that particular idea, the egregore, whatever, the more reinforced it becomes and the more it comes to the fore. So it could be fear, because that's a strong, powerful human emotion. So, but it could also equally be another kind of emotion. But we tend to notice the more negative things. We tend to notice the, you know, I think it's even true with precognition and some kind of experiences like this, where you'll tune in, like I did in the Soho experience that's in the film, or in some other precognitive events. People often tune into something that has a huge emotional outpouring. They often tune into a terrorist attack or a plane crash or something like that that has this huge emotional connection to it. But then when you also dig into the research, you find that other emotional, strong, powerful, impactful experiences also tend to be present in the research. So I think if consciousness is extended, which it, from everything I've researched and all the work I've done, it seems to suggest that it is. If that's the case, then maybe within that broader consciousness or non-local consciousness, there can be these patterns of information that we could call an egregore or a servitor, or these different concepts of constructed artificial consciousness, if you like.
Yeah, because I find that quite interesting, because what Ollie was saying before, you know, about the relationship between the observer and the wave function, and the idea that subatomic particles, you know, effectively the wave particle duality, and, you know, we've got buckyballs with 60 atoms in them that are actually showing wave particle duality. Clearly there seems to be a direct relationship between the observer and the observed in a far more subtle way than we've ever understood before. So in which case our hallucinations, in raised commas, could we be bringing them into existence? But just because we're bringing them to existence doesn't mean they don't have independence of us. And I think this is the kind of subtleness and the depth needing to be going, I think, in the future in terms of looking into these things.
Yeah, I think it's an extended mind, but we also need to think that with consciousness and or sensory interaction with the world around us, we are the product of, in many ways, of the sensory information around us. We've evolved into this particular form with eyes and ears and all the rest of it in order to interact with our environment. So we are the product of that environment, as well as interacting and acting upon it. So it's a two-way situation. And I think that probably that interconnection, that extension, it continues with the mind, continues with consciousness. And I think that probably reality and the personal human experience they aren't separate in that sense. They are all interconnected. And so, you know, that's why, like I say, we break all these things up for the sake of language. We say, oh, you know, this is telepathy, and this is in a box here, and this is consciousness, and this is here. But consciousness and telepathy are a part of each other. They're you know, and all these other things are all a part of that. I mean, there's different theories, like Edwin May in the US, who does a lot of remote viewing and precognition research. He thinks that precognition is probably the basis of all psychic abilities, all psi abilities, for example. So he doesn't think there's a mechanism as such. He thinks that it's all just kind of going, that you're picking up something from the future ahead of time. You know, I'm not saying I subscribe to that, but it's an interesting way to look at it, because generally we think in terms of what's the medium. In the past, they used to talk about the astral or the etheric. This is how we interact and this is how we experience. But I think now things are starting to kind of step outside even that paradigm, that there's a medium by which things are working. Maybe it is just, it's a fundamental, like gravity or whatever. So.
Brilliant. Okay, another question, Amir, I think.
I thought we could bring in Jade to ask you a question as the only panelist that didn't have a question directed at them at the beginning. Also, the next question might involve you more in terms of, perhaps you can add to this or change it, Jade. It's up to you.
Okay. Yeah.
So Charlie is also on the panel, and Charlie's background is in Dream Yoga and Tibetan Buddhism, and particularly the lineage of Kagyu, which is a Tibetan Buddhist lineage. So how do out-of-body experiences sit within the framework of Tibetan Buddhism and your lineage?
Okay, so first thing to say is they out-of-body experience practice, so intentionally inducing out-of-body experiences is a core practice within what's called Milam Naljor. So Milam is a Tibetan word that means dream, and Naljor is usually translated as yoga, like dream yoga, but actually the more precise translation is natural state, which is kind of cool actually. So within these dream yoga teachings, dream yoga is a term that refers to a selection of teachings including lucid dreaming, but also what in the West we refer to as out-of-body experience or astral projection, and what in the West you'll probably call like conscious sleeping. It's actually consciousness of deep sleep, which is actually one of the most profound aspects of all the dream yogas. So number one, they're separate. It is a thing, and it's not the same as lucid dreaming. And there's actually quite a lot in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, quite a lot of emphasis placed on telling the difference. So lucid dream is the same definition as it is in the waking state, a experience of self-reflective awareness within your, personal dream state, within the REM dreaming sleep state. Out-of-body experience is referred to as special dream body practice. So that's the term you're looking for if you look through any of these texts, special dream body practice. And special dream body practice is basically meets the definitions of what in the West was called out-of-body experience. But I think their definitions actually probably a little bit more precise, as in there is actually a part of your energy body, your subtle body is dislocating from the gross corporeal form, this physical body, and dislocating. It is kind of leaving. It's not just a form of kind of remote viewing or something. This is a subtle energetic body that is dislocating from the gross corporeal form in exactly the same way as it would do at death. So there's already a link, just like with the lucid dreaming practices. The reason you'll do special dream body practice is a practice for death. So Akon Rinpoche, a famously conservative Lama and a man of very few words, when I asked him about astral projection or out-of-body experience, he said, yes, have a rehearsal before death. That is good. Exactly the same thing happens. So the out-of-body experience is used to have the experience of disembodied consciousness so that when you have it at death, it won't be such a shock. It was also used in a utilitarian fashion, which is quite cool. People often don't hear about this. Tibet's like a massive place, right? So let's say you're in Lhasa and there's a teaching going on in Kham, which is like 5 days by horseback or something. You would use the special dream body practice to project out of your body and go and listen to the teachings. Now, whether in that case it was more of a kind of a remote viewing consciousness or whether the actual, energy body was leaving, who knows, but it had utilitarian function. It was based on the fact Tibet was such a big place. The Dalai Lama has been quoted in an aside, just like off the cuff comment, that it would make you the perfect spy. So we are talking about validating out-of-body experiences based on like objective reality. And when I was taught the practice, when I was encouraged in the practice by Akon Rinpoche, he said to tell the difference between a lucid dream and an out-of-body experience, when you shift out of the body, leave your house, go down the street and check the numbers on the doors. He then said, next day you go with notepad, you check, same numbers, different numbers, you check. So I was really surprised with the amount of focus there was on verifying objective reality OBEs and absolutely distinguishing them from lucid dreams in comparison with out-of-body experience. So yes, it is a practice. It's usually in the Karma Kagyu tradition only taught as part of the 3 or 4 year retreat. Other traditions like the Nyingma tradition, it's not always taught in retreat. You can get teachings outside of retreat. But yeah, it's not like a left field practice. It's a core practice. It's encouraged to do it. It's preparation for death. It's good for you. And it is not the same as lucid dreaming.
Charlie, I love this kind of Tibetan Zoom equivalent, much less technological.
Oh, right, yeah, projecting out, to go and watch the teachings.
Yeah. I have a question. So in your experience, when I first met you, you talked about an experience you had whereby you were able, in a lucid dream, to get into one of your students' dreams. So was that an out-of-body lucid dream experience, do you think? Because it seemed to have some critical elements to it in that you were able to describe their dream to them the next day.
I think it was the other way around, if it's the story I think I'm telling you, where they entered my dream.
Oh, I got it muddled up maybe.
It was still a brilliant story. Yeah, this is when I was doing the Dream Forum, which now has a lot of people at it, but back in the day only had like 5 or 6 people. And we used to run these experiments where I would say, like, for the next week, for the next month until next month's Dream Forum. Dream Forum is like kind of Alcoholics Anonymous or Lucid Dreamers based, kind of chat group, support group kind of thing. I am a lucid dreamer. And I said, for the next month, I will open up my dream space. And if you get lucid, I'm giving you permission to enter my dream. There seemed to be something about that, giving people permission. And yeah, basically one guy nailed it. It was very specific info he gave. And he hit me up on Facebook Messenger, and I could tell the validation I gave him and the time he sent me the dream report, there's no way he could have written that quick enough. So it's pretty good. Anyway, he got lucid. He called out, Charlie Morley's dream now, Charlie Morley's dream now. He then had an experience of being on a beach, and in the middle of the beach was like a perspex kind of field, like kind of a plastic kind of dome thing. And behind the plastic dome, he saw me wearing a hat, drinking a cocktail, standing up to my knees in water. And he was banging on the perspex going, Charlie, it's me. I'm doing the experiment. I'm lucid. I'm lucid. And he said, when I looked at him, I looked kind of drunk, but not because of the cocktail, because I had like very low level of awareness. Now, at that same time, like literally the same kind of real time, I was having the following dream that I had written in my dream diary and then compare with him. It was a non-lucid dream. I was on a beach, standing at a bar in knee-deep water. So he didn't see the bar. I was wearing a hat, holding a cocktail, standing in knee-deep water. Those are three very specific elements, and he nailed them all. So whether that was lucid dream with Psy, whether he was actually, you know, projecting some element from his psyche into mine, I don't know. But as far as kind of lucid dream Psy experience, I think that ticked all the boxes. Yeah. No, I have never entered anyone else's dream. I would never assume such responsibility. And I don't know how to do it anyway. Okay, another question, Amir.
Really beautiful. And by the way, because I'm looking through the question, panelists, if I ask a question and you kind of go, we've just been talking about that, why are you asking that question? Then just let me know. It's because I'm also reading questions at the same time. I can't always hear everything that's being said. So the next couple of questions, I'll kind of tie them together as they relate to fears. And I see in the chat as well, various people talking about fears that come up, and it relates, I guess, again to this malevolent or monsters, aliens, someone having an experience that whenever they start to come into an OBE or relaxed state, they encounter weird entities. They look like monsters and aliens and scary. They seem to dart straight at them. Should I continue with the experience and let them attack, or stop the session out of fear as I normally do? It happens every time I try to do an OBE. And related to this is, it says question to Jade, but there might be others who have a comment on this. What advice would you give to someone who wants to experience OBE but is anxious about letting go? So kind of two different fears that can come up in this context.
You're muted, Jade.
Yeah, so I come up against this a lot. A lot of OBE teachers do. In fact, the biggest block to out-of-body experience is fear and limiting beliefs. We all have them. And so, yeah, there's a couple of things there. So there's loads of stuff you can do to overcome fear. There's overcome fear of having out-of-body experience, overcome fear of, I call this the three irrational but understandable fears. Will I come back to my physical body? Will I be attacked by an entity? And will I get possessed? And will I go mad? So those are the four most common fears. And the arguable answer is usually no. Most experienced teachers will say, but there's numerous things you can do. It depends on what the fear is. In regards to the letting go, out-of-body experience practice is brilliant for the practice of letting go. So look at it the other way around. The out-of-body experience practice can help you with the letting go, and then in exchange of that, you'll be able to have more out-of-body experiences as well. A lot of it is to do with the unknown, and the fear isn't really coming from you. The fear is coming from your ego. Your ego's going, I've never experienced this before. Am I going to die? And that's usually the ego and just the fear of the unknown. So once you get past that, I call this the first barrier. Once you get past that barrier, usually it becomes a lot easier, although other problems related to limiting beliefs can unfold. Yes, I will leave it there because I could go on about fears all the time. I talk about shadow work in lucid dreams, which involves confronting and facing them as well. and I'll add one more thing before I leave it open. So that there is this idea that, I don't know, there is this idea, and I have seen it a lot in people, that there's a kind of a test, and it's a fear test. And once you kind of face that test, it then stops happening. And most people reference this with sleep paralysis, in that when they finally confront or meet the presence, it either changes its demeanor, its self-autonomy, and it becomes very different in terms of how it interacts with you, or it just completely vanishes. So there is something to do with meeting the fear and moving beyond it. There's loads of techniques you can do to dissolve the fear as well, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, I did, well, I've done decades of research into demons, possession, all of this kind of stuff, to find any evidence whatsoever of any harm ever coming to anyone from out-of-body experiences. And what I found is benefits. I found people healing, I found people improving their lives, I found people having transformative experiences in so many different ways. And I didn't find a single case ever of anyone ever being harmed. I just found people having these, as Jade put it, understandable fears. But I think the important thing is to remember that they are not real. They're just these fears that come up. And once you move beyond them, once you work with them and transcend them, then you open yourself up to all this healing and transformative experience that will redefine your life in amazing ways. So yeah, don't get caught up on fears and paranoia about entities. It's really based on nothing.
That's so good to hear, Graham. You know, just to kind of embargo you back there, you saying you have decades of research looking at, has anyone ever come to any harm based on, you know, these fear of possession and demons and all this kind of stuff, and your research has come up with
it
nothing.
all falls apart. I went really into the possessional stuff. I went into the original case behind The Exorcist even, which falls apart as well. It was just it was a small boy who the real case, and when you look into it, it was just that the priest had these strong religious beliefs, and even a witness to the actual case stated that it was just the beliefs of the priest. So, you know, then I looked into Goetia, the books of demons and all of this kind of stuff, and again, nothing. It just, most of it ends up just being pre-Christian gods that the later Christians were scared of. And the more I went into it, you know, all these cases, the more it just all kind of crumbled really the moment you scratched the surface. And I just didn't find anything of any substance to show that people can be harmed by the experiences. And like I said, I then started finding cases of spontaneous healing, of transformative, you know, things that change people's lives. So yeah.
Could you clarify maybe, Graham, when you say they're not real, did you mean the entities, the fears, or both?
I lean towards that they're not real in the sense that they cannot harm you. You know, we have psychological processes, we have different belief systems and all the rest of it, but I've never seen any evidence that they can do any harm in any real sense. And as David mentioned, you know, going into the experience, going into the negative form actually often dissolves it. And I've heard Charlie say a similar thing with his practice as well, that by actually like hugging the demon, you know, or just doing something like that, and it just dissolves away. So I think possibly, as we were just talking about earlier, it could be that we're creating these entities from our own fears, and when we overcome the fear, then the entity becomes unreal and dissolves away. So you know, I don't say anything categorical about whether it exists or not. That's a really tricky, complicated question, you know, because we can't even really answer, does consciousness exist, or these kinds of things. So when you start saying that something doesn't, I think you're getting into tricky ground. But I think that, so what I did is I focused on tangible negative impacts of out-of-body experiences, and I didn't find any. I found the opposite.
That's very cool to hear.
Very interesting.
I just feel moved to say something, which is that in my experience, both from my research and my personal explorations and the reading that I've done, I think it's really important when for people, you know, so for all 134 people on this call, most probably, and us as well, those who feel drawn towards transpersonal experiences and out-of-body experiences and the extraordinary side of human nature, it's super important that in your journey you don't overlook your own personal unconscious and the rather mundane crap that's in it. Because it's quite easy to try and think, well, you know, the stuff that kind of my own little personal trauma, this seems so small and benign. So if I just kind of go out to the big stuff, then I can just ignore this seemingly small, these insecurities that plague me, whatever it might be. But I think that's kind of a defense mechanism that, you know, you can kind of try and glamorize your own shit by kind of saying that it's got transpersonal origins or something. So I'd say, you know, kind of in your journey, you know, just make sure you give time to the mundane, to the selfish, to the grotty aspects of yourself, and which, you know, is absolutely integral to human nature, as well as the rather extraordinary elements as well that do come with, you know, extraordinary transformative powers, but can also draw you away from much of what it means to be human, which is, as I say, to deal with that, with the nitty-gritty as well.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
And potentially related to that, maybe it follows on, is someone asking, during an OBE, is it possible to speak to your higher self, higher awareness, like one can in a lucid dream?
Well, I suppose I could jump in there in the sense that one of my books was called The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, which is an analysis of, if we do have a higher self, what are the neurological aspects of that, and indeed what are the historical aspects of that, the theological aspects. And I believe that many of, I do not have, I've never had an out of the body experience. I've only ever had one lucid dream, so I'm probably not the right person to talk about this. But I would suspect that probably a great deal of the encounters we have under these circumstances will probably be related to our own higher self, the being I call the daemon, and that in some way the daemon is facilitating the dream scenario, either to give you information or guidance in one way or another. And one of the exercises I'm working on at the moment is I'm working on a paper at present of finding techniques and ways in which we can open up communication channels between the daemon and what I call the eidolon, which is the everyday self. And if anybody out there has any stories or experiences of encountering what you would call yourself or your higher self in dreams or lucid dreams or out of body experiences, I'm extremely keen to hear about you. And hear about your experiences. So please do contact me if you've had these.
And just to emphasize to everyone, so glancing back through the questions, there's lots of really brilliant questions, and unfortunately there's never time to go through all of them. So I'm just going to pick the one at the top of the list, and it may be the last one for this evening as we're nearing the end time. And it just calls for any thoughts on sleep phases. Lucid dreaming tends to be associated with REM sleep phase. How does astral projection relate to the sleep phases, as many examples have been given of people entering the astral domain or others via lucid dreaming, i.e. via the REM phase? So I guess any thoughts on that topic?
You can enter an out-of-body experience from any conscious state. It's not specific to lucid dreaming. You can also enter it even from no brain state. So we have the near-death experiences that seem to confirm that even when there's no brain activity, we can still enter an out-of-body experience. So I think sometimes especially at the moment, there's a lot more emphasis on lucid dream-based practice, but if we go back through the research and the history of the out-of-body experience, it wasn't specific to talking in terms of lucid dream states. So while different phases of sleep might be a helpful way to enter into different experiences, like some form of out-of-body experience, like I mentioned, I tend to think the sleep paralysis-based ones and the sleep ones are a little bit more tricky to work with in terms of the objectivity of the experience. So I tend to favor the conscious approaches because you have more objectivity and the experience is more consistent. So I think actually, when you look at it, the same with psychic ability can happen in any brain state whatsoever. And I think it's true of the out-of-body experience as well. So it's not necessary to focus on a particular type of state. It's more, as in sleep or waking, it's more relevant to focus on the depth of unawareness of the body. So it could be like sleep is a good way of shutting down body awareness, whereas also deep meditation, sensory deprivation, trance states from movement, for example, all of these things are all other ways of shutting down body awareness and inducing an out-of-body experience.
And there's just a few minutes left, so I don't know if there's a specific way you want to wrap up, Charlie, or invite panelists to maybe see if there's a particular question that really grabs them or something that hasn't been said yet that would feel incomplete if we...
Yeah, I mean, I think we should do kind of final closing statements from our panelists that remain. A bit like in the last one where I asked you, where would you like to see consciousness research going in the next 20 years? What would your final closing statements be on people who've been watching this, who are interested in out-of-body experience, whether the fact they want to learn it or have one or have had one? What would your closing comments be for people? Where should they go now? You know, what next on their path? What could you leave them with? Whether it's resources or a tip or a closing statement. Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking on my feet now because no, I mean, I didn't have anything for this bit, but this is great. We're live, right? So I'm just kind of freestyling here.
Sounds great.
But any kind of closing comments would be great. So maybe I'll go from the top again. Dr. David.
Not much to say other than, you know, keep an open mind, but not so much that your brains fall out. So, you know, head in the clouds, feet on the ground. These can be kind of quite extraordinary terrains, and, you know, kind of lead to all kinds of ontological cul-de-sacs. So just explore things with an open mind and, you know, just on a journey of discovery and see what works for you. But it's also good to kind of back all this up with a lot of the research that is out there and the kind of expertise of people like this on the panel.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Jade.
Just to say, really, you know, we can theorize and hypothesize and academically look at all of these extraordinary experiences, but as Oliver said, there are other ways of knowing. So do it, learn the practice. There are some amazing questions. Learn the practice and try it for yourself. You can read all about apples from a book, but until you actually bite an apple, how does that change how you feel about the apple? So give it a go.
Graham.
I would say that everybody on this panel represents a new paradigm in thinking on this topic. I think what's really interesting is in where we are right now is, for example, when Sue was talking earlier about the astral bodies and the silver cords and all of that stuff, the old paradigm, I think it's interesting that what everyone represents here is a new way of looking at it and a new paradigm to it. I think everyone here is saying, we don't know where it's going to go right now. We don't know where the answers are going to come from and what's the new directions that are going to unfold. But everyone here is like trying to take a step out of the assumptions and the backwards thinking and say, okay, what might really be going on here and how can we do it more effectively? And I think that's really exciting. And I think I would encourage everyone watching this to explore these writers, all these people here, and this new paradigm that we're entering.
Brilliant. Thank you, Graham. Anthony?
It's very difficult to follow what everybody else has said, but I particularly echo Graham's comments. We are trying to push the envelope here. We're trying to change the old science into a new science, a science that is more inclusive of extraordinary human experiences, because effectively even science is only the human brain processing the information that nature is giving us. And to exclude a whole area of human experiences just because it doesn't fit in with the present scientific paradigm is not science, it's scientism. Now, for me, the most exciting thing that's going to be happening in the next few years is experiences of individuals like yourselves that are involved in this group. And I think the only way we can do this is by working together. And that means by swapping information, cross-fertilizing ideas, and working together. We're creating a worldwide movement here. It really is very, very important. And all I can say is that I'm thankful to have been invited on this panel. As I say, I'm not an OBE experiencer, nor am I an OBE trainer. I'm very much somebody who's just interested in the phenomenon. And I'm very keen to hear from your experiences, if that's possible. We're embarking on some very exciting times. We're going to change the paradigm, all of us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anthony. Oliver. Ollie.
Yeah. So I would say to everybody, try this. Try going one day without saying anything or reading anything. See what it feels like. See what it feels like to return to a world which without, beyond words. We get drenched in the verbal, and this has been a very verbal few hours. But, reality existed for millions of years before any language appeared, and will exist for millions of years after it disappears. Remember that you are one with that reality.
Brilliant. Thanks, man. Great advice. Luciana, we can't see your video, but are you there? Can you hear us? And would you like to have a closing comment? Oh, I think she had to go early, didn't she?
She wouldn't be able to.
Yes, okay, no probs. Okay, well, I will give a closing comment then. I would advise everybody to have an out-of-body experience. When I first had them, I basically used to think out-of-body experiences were just lucid dreams. And it was just a lucid dreamer who wasn't fully lucid and thought that they were leaving their body, but they weren't. And then I had an out-of-body experience. And the first one I ever had was I was awake. I wasn't even in a hypnagogic state. And my sense of who I am shifted out of my physical body. Once you know that you are not exclusively limited to this gross corporeal form, but you are habitually limited to this gross corporeal form, and that is a habit that can be broken with specific practices, life will change forever. Because so much of our suffering is tied up in the fact that we think we are this. So when someone insults this or injures this or projects their bullshit onto this, we hurt. Once you know that you're more than this flesh suit, and have always been more than this flesh suit, in my opinion, life changes for the better. So I would advise everyone to have an out-of-body experience if you can. Okay. Well, Amir, unless there's anything else.
Yeah, I'll just speak on behalf of all the attendees. Just a lot of people saying thank you and a lot of gratitude coming in the comments. Thank you as well to everyone attending. Obviously, these things can't happen without people interested in them, and the more people interested in these kind of events, the more of these kind of events there'll be. So it's a two-way relationship, and many of the panelists I haven't met before. So thank you for coming and being involved with Psychedelic Society. Thank you, Jade, for being the vision behind this being pulled together, and Charlie for hosting, and all the panelists for contributing so warmly. And if all went well, then this has been recorded, so we'll send this out as well as many other resources to everyone that spoke.
Great. So thank you, Amir. Thank you, Psychedelic Society. So Psychedelic Society will be sending you an email with the link to this recording, and also links to all the speakers and any courses they've got coming up and stuff like that. So thank you so much. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jade. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Amir. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.